The Satanic Panic represents one of the most striking examples of moral panic in modern Western history. Scanning primarily in the 1980s and early 1990s, this phenomenon saw the rise of widespread societal fears in the United States that secretive satanic cults were committing horrific acts of ritual abuse, particularly targeting children. Allegations emerged that these cults had infiltrated daycare centres, schools, churches, and even law enforcement agencies. Public hysteria surged through a potent combination of fear-mongering media, evangelical Christian influence, pseudoscientific psychology, and a legal system ill-equipped to handle claims that were, in many cases, entirely fabricated or uncorroborated. This mass panic did not erupt overnight. It was rooted in a confluence of historical anxieties, including Cold War paranoia, generational fears about changing family structures, and the rising influence of religious conservatism. As traditional norms were being challenged by the sexual revolution, feminist movements, and secularism, many conservative segments of American society perceived these changes not just as a social upheaval, but as spiritual warfare, an assault by evil forces seeking to corrupt the nation's moral core. In such a climate, the idea that literal Satanists were operating in the shadows became frighteningly plausible to large swaths of the population. Media outlets, particularly sensationalist television talk shows and tabloid newspapers, amplified these fears, giving voice to alleged victims, self-styled cult survivors, and fringe professionals claiming expertise in satanic ritual abuse. These stories were often presented as unquestionable truths, despite lacking empirical evidence. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies launched investigations based on testimonies extracted through coercive or suggestive interviewing techniques, particularly with children. The legal consequences were devastating. Numerous individuals, including teachers and childcare workers, were falsely accused, publicly vilified, and in many cases imprisoned for crimes that never occurred. Although the moral panic was most virulent in the United States, its cultural footprint extended beyond American borders. As American television, literature, and evangelical ideology were exported abroad, echoes of the panic could be heard in other English-speaking countries, particularly in the United Kingdom and, to a lesser extent, Ireland. The question arises, did Ireland, with its distinct religious identity, cultural conservatism, and history of institutional abuse, fall victim to the same satanic hysteria? This video seeks to unpack the roots and repercussions of the Satanic Panic in the United States before turning to examine how far it extended across the Atlantic. In particular, it explores whether Ireland, shaped by Catholic dominance and its own moral crises, experienced its own version of the panic and whether it remained largely immune to this imported fear. By comparing the American experience with developments in Ireland, we gain a clear understanding of how moral panics operate, how they are transmitted across borders, and what conditions make society vulnerable or resistant to them.
Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to Time Machine. For thousands of years, one of the most enduring symbols of evil has been the witch. What do you see in your mind's eye at the word witch? An old hag dressed in black, wart on her nose, flying on a broomstick, her bone-chilling cackle striking fear into hearts? Well, that is the stereotypical witch that we've come to know and despise from fairy tales. But in real life, people of all shapes and sizes have been accused of being witches, and sometimes their stories are more terrifying than any in Mother Goose. Witches, These are the images modern Americans conjure up when they think of witches and witchcraft.
America has a long history of religious intolerance and persecuting people for their religion.
For more than 300 years, witches have been persecuted, from the Salem witches to the modern-day practitioners of ancient voodoo rites. The most notorious episode of mass persecution of so-called witches began here. It was near the end of the 17th century in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Watching this reenactment, Salem tourists still experience a sense of the hysteria that gripped that small town back in 1692.
Can you not hear this? This madness? A plague comes among us and you sit in silence and you listen and you believe. If they are allowed to continue, we will all be witches and devils quickly.
The colonists of Salem had just endured another long and bitter winter. Crops were scarce, taxes were high, smallpox was rampant, and they were surrounded by Indians whom they called savages. These Native Americans practiced ceremonies that seemed strange and supernatural to the Europeans.
The Puritans looked at Indian customs and saw the hand of the devil. The Indians were seen as a constant threat and enemy on the one hand, and as a scapegoat on the other.
It was no wonder then that the Salem witch hunts began with the arrest of Tituba, a West Indian slave owned by the Reverend Samuel Parris. Torn from her exotic island homeland of Barbados, Tituba lived in the unfamiliar surroundings of Salem Village, where she spent her time tending to Elizabeth Parris, the bored and restless daughter of Samuel Parris. Here in a darkened kitchen, Tituba entertained Elizabeth and her cousin Abigail Williams, teaching them the art of fortune-telling and instructing them in ritual chanting and dancing.
Well, Tituba brought with her to the Salem colony all of the folk beliefs and practices of Western Africa. She was a slave, and of course, she was somewhat learned in practices of fortune-telling, popular divination.
In their excitement, the girls began to share Tituba's forbidden secrets with friends. They invited other young Puritans to join their circle at the Parris home to read palms, tell fortunes, and to dance. But their fun was soon spoiled when the adults became suspicious of this bizarre behavior.
You should be taken to the dungeon and hanged!
They see either the punishing hand of God or the work of Satan at work in their lives.
When the girls began to have traumatic convulsions, hysterical fits that caused their bodies to twist and jerk uncontrollably, the adults attributed these symptoms to demonic possession.
When the young women involved began having hysterical fits and outbreaks, when they were given to writhing on the floor, speaking in unintelligible phrases, fingers began to point to Tituba.
Since Tituba was an outsider to the Puritan religion, it was easy for everyone to believe that she was a witch. But then the girls went on to name Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two elderly neighbors who fit the description of an English witch.
We as human beings have a tendency to associate evilness with ugliness. And given the way our gender codes work, given the way we think about relationships between men and women, we often don't know what to do with the elderly, especially if they're not very pleasant to look at.
Mass hysteria consumed the village. Stories of witches in Salem spread like wildfire. To the villagers, the stories were proof that an angry God was punishing them by allowing witches and other hardships to plague Salem.
Lord, protect us, the devil has come to Salem!
The assumption was that this was a sign from God that something was wrong. And frequently it had to do with improper worship of one kind or another.
If you are so holy, Goody Proctor, could
Could you say for us now the Lord's Prayer?
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Events then moved swiftly. A court was set up. Hundreds of people, most of them women, were accused of being witches and called to stand trial.
Some people have called the great witch hunts of Western Europe and the witch hunts in England and the Salem witch trials as all part of, for lack of a better term, a women's Holocaust.
They were stripped and searched for mole-like growths believed to be the marks of the devil.
It could be as simple as a birthmark. It could be as simple as a port wine stain, a defective birth. It could be a wound, a scar.
It was as simple as pointing a finger at a next-door neighbor.
The key problem with the Salem evidence was that it was spectral in nature, and by that I mean that an individual's apparition or his appearance could commit the supposed crime.
By the end of that summer, 1692, 19 people had been hanged.
It is the last of the great witch scares, but it's almost as though it moves from Europe, continental Europe, to England, to the United States. Belief in witchcraft was very powerful among the Puritans.
The religious beliefs was in fact the source of great conflict in the community and really fostered that whole situation that existed in 1692.
Although the Salem witch hunt had ended, fear of witches and witchcraft would continue to haunt Americans for centuries to follow.
I am not a witch! I'm not a witch! I be not a witch!
Going to the ocean, we all come from the goddess.
She was born woman, part man, part cat, and a whole lot of devil.
Grace Sherwood, the mysterious witch of Pungo, is Virginia's most celebrated witch.
Of course, Grace was an attractive woman, and she wore men's trousers, which was kind of unheard of back in the 1700s.
The legendary witch is said to have lived in this house in the early 18th century.
She was a self-assured, independent woman. So she must have been a witch, right? That's the logic, that's the reasoning. That alone, throughout history, has been enough to condemn women for witchery. Okay? From Joan of Arc to Sinead O'Connor, people have made this claim and this charge.
Grace Sherwood was one of the few women to be tried for witchcraft after the Salem cases. Her ordeal began in court in 1697, when she and her husband James lost a libel suit brought against their neighbors John and Jane Gisborne.
The Gisbornes accused Grace of blowing her bewitched breath on their cotton crop and causing the cotton to not, their crop that they had not to be up to the standards of what they expected. So again, Ms. Gisborne accused her of being a witch.
A year later, the rumors intensified. The Sherwoods were furious, seeking vengeance. They brought yet another lawsuit against Anthony and Elizabeth Barnes, and again they lost. Tales of a black cat and black magic suddenly transformed this 18th century legal battle into a mysterious tale that still intrigues the townsfolk of Pungo.
She attacked Elizabeth Barnes. She jumped on her back. Her fingernails turned to claws like on a cat. Teeth sprung out of her mouth like fangs. She had to have blood. The devil is what she called her, and she sucked on this woman's neck until her mouth was full of blood. And then she escaped out the door as a cat is told.
This version of the testimony seems preposterous today, but it conveys the fear that many early Americans had of people accused of witchcraft. By the spring of 1706, the General Court had grown weary of these suspicious reports and decided to launch a full-scale investigation of Grace Sherwood.
The judge told the sheriff to get a jury of 12 women to search Grace to see if she had any signs of being a witch and to go to her home and search the area. Well, he called together a group of 12 ladies. And unfortunately for Grace, Elizabeth Barnes, who had accused her of the black cat proposition, was the jury foreman. So anyway, they searched her, and they said that they found 2 things of black color on her privates, such as a tit.
With only this evidence, the judge ordered Grace jailed in the old courthouse. It was here, where this old farmhouse now stands, that Grace waited in shackles for her brutal medieval ordeal by water known as the ducking trial.
The whole theory behind that was that if you were a witch, that the water was pure, and if you were a witch and were dunked in the water, the water would not accept you. It would merely, you would swim or live through it. So it was kind of crazy in a way because Grace couldn't win either way.
On July 10th, 1706, Grace was taken down to the Lynnhaven River to a place now known as Witch Duck Point.
She did not drown. She floated. And they took her out and searched her again. And then they took her over and put her in the jail where she stayed.
Although Grace spent 7 years in jail awaiting another ordeal, no further trials were held. Grace was released and lived to be 80 years old. Even in death, the legendary Grace was true to character.
She was on her deathbed and she beckoned her 3 sons to come to her. And in doing so, she asked that they take her out of her bed, lay her feet in the ashes of the fireplace. And with that, there was a terrible storm going on outside. And a gust of wind came down the chimney, blew out the fire. And when the fire rekindled, Grace was gone. The devil had come to claim his own. And the only thing left were the 2 hooves of her heels in the ashes.
Even though the Sherwood trial was an isolated episode in the history of 18th century Virginia, these kinds of fanciful tales still haunt the superstitious subconscious of American history. Stories like the Witch of Pungo make modern-day Americans more susceptible to headlines and TV specials that focus on devil worshippers and black magic, rather than on examinations of the more mundane beliefs and practices of those Americans who still call themselves witches.
The roots of the Satanic Panic in the United States are complex and multifaceted, emerging from the collision of religious, psychological, political, and media-driven forces. While the panic reached its peak during the 1980s and early 1990s, the groundwork had been laid over decades, shaped by cultural shifts and deep societal anxieties. The cultural upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s fundamentally transformed American society. The civil rights movement, sexual liberation, second wave feminism, and growing secularism challenged traditional norms of family, authority, and morality. Many Americans, particularly those aligned with conservative or evangelical worldviews, saw these changes as deeply threatening. Into this cultural vacuum entered a moral narrative that frames such a change not merely as political or cultural evolution, but as spiritual decline, a loss of divine order. This narrative set the stage for what would become the Satanic Panic, a belief that dark, even supernatural forces were at work in society, corrupting children, undermining Christian values, and eroding the American way of life from within. The late 1970s saw the formation of a powerful coalition between the conservative evangelical Christians and right-wing political figures. Organisations such as Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority and Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition mobilised millions of believers into a cohesive political force. These groups aimed to restore traditional and Christian values in American law and culture, frequently warning of demonic influences behind secular trends. Many evangelical preachers and authors began claiming that satanic forces were literally at work in the world through rock music, fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons, and New Age spirituality. Books like Turmoil in the Toy Box, written in 1986, claimed that children's toys were imbued with demonic symbolism. Halloween, heavy metal music, and horror films were all interpreted as gateways to demonic influence. In this climate, the idea of widespread satanic conspiracies seemed not only possible but probable. The publication of Michelle Remembers, co-authored by Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Lawrence Pazder and his patient and later wife, Michelle Smith, is widely regarded as a catalyst for the Satanic Panic. The book details Michelle's recovered memories of being abused by a satanic cult in Victoria, British Columbia during her childhood in the 1950s. These memories were allegedly recovered through therapy sessions under hypnosis. Although later debunked and discredited by investigators and scholars, with no corroborating evidence ever found, the book was a massive bestseller. It was treated as a factual account by many readers, and Pazder became a sought-after consultant in law enforcement and legal cases involving alleged ritual abuse. His influence on police training and social work was profound, despite the lack of empirical validation for his claims. Importantly, Michelle Remembers introduced key elements that would become recurring tropes in this panic: secret cults, intergenerational abuse, ritual sacrifice, the involvement of trusted community figures, and the silencing of victims through fear and intimidation. In the 1980s, a wave of therapists, some influenced by the likes of Pazder, embraced the concept of recovered memories. According to this model, traumatic memories of abuse, particularly ritual abuse, could be buried deep in the subconscious and retrieved through guided therapy, hypnosis, or even dream interpretation. Many therapists begin diagnosing patients, often women with depression, anxiety, or eating disorders, as survivors of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, based solely on suggestive questioning and confirmation bias. As the number of alleged survivors grew, their testimony often matched the themes popularized by Michelle Remembers, leading therapists to believe that they were uncovering evidence of massive hidden conspiracy. The psychological community was deeply divided on the legitimacy of recovered memories. Eventually, studies in the 1990s would reveal the malleability of memory and the dangers of suggestive therapeutic techniques, but by then, damage was done. Families had been torn apart, reputation destroyed, and innocent people imprisoned. The most explosive manifestation of the Satanic Panic was the series of daycare and preschool abuse cases that erupted across the US in the 1980s. The most infamous was the McMartin preschool case in Manhattan Beach, California. In 1983, a single allegation of child abuse quickly escalated into claims of satanic rituals, animal sacrifices, secret tunnels under the school, and other fantastical elements. Children were interviewed repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times, by social workers, using leading, coercive, and highly suggestive questioning. Experts today recognize these interviews as textbook examples of how to create false memories in young minds. Nevertheless, the McMartin case dragged on for 7 years, costing the state over $15 million and resulting in no convictions. Other similar cases followed: the Keller case in Texas, the Little Rascals Daycare case in North Carolina, the Fells Acres Daycare case in Massachusetts. In nearly every instance, the allegations included fantastical, impossible claims of underground tunnels, satanic ceremonies in graveyards, flying through the air, or animals being killed and resurrected. These cases all followed a near identical script, influenced heavily by media reports and professional experts on satanic cults. Television played a crucial role in disseminating and reinforcing satanic panic narratives. Sensationalist talk shows like Geraldo, Oprah, Sally Jesse Raphael, and 2020 regularly featured alleged victims of satanic abuse, experts on cults, and emotionally charged stories designed to shock and entertain. In 1988, Geraldo Rivera hosted an infamous NBC special titled Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground, which drew in an audience of over 20 million viewers. Rivera declared that more than 1 million Satanists were operating in the US alone, a figure pulled from thin air but taken seriously by viewers. Concurrently, heavy metal music, horror films, and fantasy games became scapegoats. Bands like Metallica, Slayer, and Ozzy Osbourne were accused of inciting satanic behaviour through lyrics and imagery. Teen suicides were sometimes blamed on music or Dungeons and Dragons, leading to congressional hearings and public outrage. This cultural scapegoating formed part of a broader cultural war in America, conservative forces waging a battle against perceived liberal permissiveness, and pop culture became an easy and visible target. Underlying the Satanic Panic was the archetype of the hidden enemy within, a recurring motif in American history. From fears of communist infiltration during the Red Scare to anxieties about immigrant criminality, American culture has long been prone to conspiracy-based explanations for social problems. The Satanic Panic carried this impulse to new heights. People were encouraged to believe that a vast underground network of Satan-worshipping abusers, often including teachers, police officers, judges, and even parents, had managed to stay hidden in plain sight for decades. The more implausible the claim, the more it seemed to confirm the conspiracy. Of course they're good at hiding. It's all part of the satanic plan. The Satanic Panic in the United States was not the product of a single cause, but rather a direct, perfect storm of cultural fears, religious fundamentalism, flawed therapeutic practices, and media sensationalism. It was a classic moral panic, in which an entire society projected its anxieties about modernity, family breakdown, secularism, and cultural change onto an imagined, malevolent other. The legacy of this panic is still felt today, in both legal precedents and in the continued popularity of conspiracy theories that echo its themes.
As long as the public has this idea of witch as initially someone who rides a broomstick with black robes flowing and a black hat and so forth, there's no hope for the neo-pagans to be able to change the public perception of a witch.
Anybody involved with psychic phenomena, or what's been called the occult, has been discriminated against in the American culture almost from the beginning.
Some early European immigrants to the U.S. tried to practice non-Christian rituals like this one. Rituals that have been passed down from the pagan times of pre-Christian Europe.
Hail and welcome.
But in the 1600s, these rituals were misunderstood by the Christian ruling class and were forced underground. The religious beliefs and practices of other cultures have also been greatly misunderstood. The Chinese immigrants brought with them a belief in spirits and demons. Their original New Year's celebration included ceremonies like this to appease the ghosts of their ancestors, drive away demons, and ward off bad luck.
I'm sure that traditionally the use of firecrackers was meant to chase away the baleful spirits, but they're very festive and they're a lot of fun. So, I mean, they serve a dual function.
These misunderstandings often contributed to the violence that occurred as a result of cultural differences. Perhaps the most tragic example can be seen in Native American history. These are the descendants of Sitting Bull, the once great leader of the Sioux Nation. In the late 1800s, the Sioux were so desperate to defeat the United States Army that they followed the advice of prophets who introduced the ghost dance. In battles with white soldiers, the ghost dancers believed that the spirits would protect them from bullets.
These were people who felt that their culture was dying, and it was an effort to both revitalize the culture spiritually and to provide real resistance against white encroachment onto Indian lands. The ghost dance was an extremely powerful force for change and political organization, especially in the Midwest.
As a result of these misconceptions, many religions identified with witchcraft have been driven underground. It happened first with voodoo in the city of New Orleans in the early 19th century. Voodoo originated in Africa and Haiti. It was brought to New Orleans by slaves.
Voodoo is an Afro-Caribbean religion. It is based originally upon the religion of the Yoruba people, and it comes from West Africa. And it is an extremely complex seemingly polytheistic faith with one god at the top of the pantheon.
From the beginning, Christian slave owners feared the worship of African gods. Slaves caught performing ritual dances or chants were severely punished. To protect their native beliefs, the practitioners of voodoo met in secret and camouflaged their religion by incorporating elements of Catholicism.
Remember that those practices were outlawed by the Catholic Church. The drum, for instance, was always outlawed by the Catholics, be they Spanish or French. So people had to find ways of expressing their religious beliefs and sentiments through the mediating influences of Catholic symbology. Okay? So, for instance, they would observe the feast days of the saints, but in their minds and in their hearts, they would actually be observing the festival days of their gods.
Marie Laveau, New Orleans' most famous voodoo queen, was Catholic. At first, Laveau made her living as a hairdresser, but she soon realized that she could profit much more as a voodine. By the 1830s, she had established a cult and was a very successful voodoo queen.
If you ask those who consider themselves to be in the lineage of Marie Laveau whether or not she was a true priestess of voodoo, they will say yes. If you ask other practitioners of voodoo about her, they will say, well, she was just a hairstylist who listened to gossip and knew a little bit about root magic.
Although New Orleans voodoo incorporated some Catholic rites, practitioners never worshipped the Christian God.
If you look closely at what's going on in voodoo from a Roman Catholic perspective or a Christian perspective, they are not worshiping Jesus Christ as he is portrayed in the Bible and in Christian tradition, as he's understood in Christian tradition. They are worshiping an African spirit who has been given the name Jesus Christ.
It was Marie Laveau who brought Catholic prayers and statues into the voodoo religion.
When a religion is outlawed, it must go underground. It has to find different ways of expressing itself. These religions are extremely flexible. They're very syncretistic. Okay? They can draw upon various other traditions, and they can use their symbolisms, and they can do it comfortably.
Voodoo, as practiced in New Orleans by Marie Laveau, used herbs and powders to conjure both good and evil spells. Some magical brews worked to heal the sick and help the less fortunate. Others were expressly made to bewitch and curse enemies. However, it is the infamous image of a pin-studded doll that is popularized by fictional film and TV.
That's as much a matter of Hollywood and novels about voodoo in Haiti as it is about anything else. It is not the centerpiece of the religion. In fact, voodoo practitioners, people who observe voodoo as a religion, don't use voodoo dolls.
And today, these followers are trying to dispel the stereotypes of evil voodoo and black magic. This woman, a high priestess of Haitian voodoo, is one of many practitioners who deny that pin-studded voodoo dolls and wicked spells play any role in their religion. She practices here in the tiny basement of her North Philadelphia home, where hundreds of people call on her seeking psychic advice, home-brewed remedies, and good luck charms, all in exchange for money.
as part of their training, the priest or priestess of voodoo has learned how to use herbal remedies and natural remedies. So it's very much a part of the religion.
Although traditional African voodoo is known for its mysterious spells and divine intercession, other cultures and religions have beliefs and practices based on magic and spiritual healing.
There is a deep-seated need in people to believe in the power of unseen forces, and that's often culturally based or culturally encoded. You have people who, for some illnesses, are willing to go to a modern allopathic doctor, and for other purposes, they go to the local natural healer. And that still goes on today.
While the origins of the Satanic Panic were rooted in cultural and psychological forces, its impact was far from abstract. Across the United States, real lives were destroyed, legal institutions were undermined, and public trust in systems of care and justice was shaken. The panic had deep and often devastating consequences for individuals, families, and broader American society. This part of the video explores on the major legal, social, and institutional ramifications of the phenomenon. One of the most tragic outcomes of the Satanic Panic was a large number of people, many of them innocent daycare workers or parents, who were falsely accused and imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. These cases often featured no physical evidence, no credible eyewitnesses, and testimonies built on the uncorroborated and sometimes fantastical claims of young children or adults undergoing recovered memory therapy. Among the most notable cases, the McMahon preschool case in California. Perhaps the most infamous of all, this case began in 1983 with one mother's accusation. It quickly ballooned into a 7-year legal saga costing $15 million. Although the defendants were eventually acquitted or had charges dropped, they suffered financial ruin, social ostracization, and years of emotional trauma. The Fells Acres Daycare case in Massachusetts. Gerald Emerald and members of his family were convicted based on children's testimony that included stories of flying through the air, being sexually abused by robots, and being attacked by a clown in a secret room. Emerald spent over 18 years in prison before being released. The Keller case in Texas. Fran and Dan Keller, daycare providers, were accused of ritual abuse that included flying children to Mexico for orgies and feeding them blood-laced Kool-Aid. They were convicted and served 21 years before being exonerated in 2017 after new evidence discredited the original testimony and medical reports. In all these cases, the accused were ordinary people, teachers, childcare providers, parents, whose lives were destroyed due to a climate of suspicion and hysteria. Many never fully recovered socially or financially, even after being legally vindicated. The Satanic Panic revealed serious flaws in the American legal and judicial systems. Judges and prosecutors, often under political and public pressure, gave credence to accusations that should be viewed with skepticism. Expert witnesses with dubious credentials, including self-proclaimed cult specialists, were allowed to testify without rigorous vetting. Child testimony, often elicited through repeated and suggestive questioning, were accepted without challenge. In many cases, the burden of proof was effectively reversed. Defendants were required to prove their innocence rather than prosecutors providing guilt. Juries, influenced by media coverage and emotional appeals, were often swayed by narratives rather than facts. This judicial atmosphere was deeply coloured by moral panic theory, wherein perceived threats, especially against children, produce exaggerated responses that distort legal norms. In the context of the Satanic Panic, due process and presumption of innocence were frequently sacrificed in the name of protecting the vulnerable. During and after the height of the panic, US child protection agencies underwent major changes in both training and policy. Initially, social workers and psychologists, believing they were rescuing children from genuine abuse, employed interview techniques that encouraged children to invent or embellish stories. These interviews were often long, repetitive, and leading, causing children to become confused or to say that they thought adults wanted to hear. In the 1990s, a wave of academic research on child memory and susceptibility led to a dramatic re-evaluation of these methods. Influential studies showed how young children, especially under repeated pressure, could become to believe and recall events that never occurred. As a result, new guidelines were introduced for interviewing child witness, including limiting the number of interviews, avoiding suggestive or leading questions, using open-ended questions to elicit spontaneous responses, and recording interviews to provide accountability. These reforms aim to ensure that actual cases of abuse could be investigated thoroughly and fairly without relying on flawed or coercive techniques. The social fallout from the panic extended beyond the legal system. Families were torn apart by false accusations. Children were sometimes removed from homes and placed into foster care based on unverified claims. In many communities, daycare centres closed down, parents withdrew their children out of fear, and neighbours turned on one another. Accusations of Satanism, unlike allegations of ordinary misconduct, carried an especially heavy stigma. Even after exoneration, these accused often remained socially isolated, targeted by gossip and unable to find employment. The long-term psychological toll, depression, anxiety, PTSD, was borne by both the wrongfully accused and the children involved, many of whom came to believe that they had experienced horrific abuse that never actually occurred. The Satanic Panic also left its imprint on education, entertainment, and parenting culture in the United States. Schools removed books deemed occult, such as the Harry Potter series, and discouraged Halloween celebrations. Libraries, particularly in conservative areas, banned books and music perceived as satanic, and there was increased scrutiny of youth subcultures like goths, metalheads, and role-playing gamers. That's me, sir. The panic fed into the broader culture wars of the time, reinforcing a climate of censorship and mistrust. Youth culture was seen as dangerous and corrupting, and there was a notable shift towards surveillance and control over what children read, watched, and played with. Ironically, some of the fears surrounding youth behaviour drove them further towards the very subcultures that were being demonised. For many teenagers, embracing dark aesthetics or rebellious music became a form of protest against moral authoritarianism. By the late to mid-1990s, the Satanic Panic began to collapse under the weight of its own inconsistencies and a growing body of scholarly and journalistic critique. Investigative journalists such as Debbie Nathan and Lawrence Wright published groundbreaking exposés that challenged the validity of the claims and the credibility of key witnesses and therapists. Psychological organisations, including the American Psychological Association, APA, and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, FMSF, took strong public stances against recovered memory practice that lacked scientific validation. Courts began overturning convictions, and many of those imprisoned were released, some with apologies and compensation, others without. Despite the collapse of the panic, its effects lingered. Public trust in daycares remained fragile. Some therapists continued to promote discredited methods, and the idea of hidden evil infiltrating society evolved into new conspiracy theories, such as QAnon, which would resurface in the 2010s and 2020s, with similar themes: satanic cabals, child trafficking, elite conspiracies. The social and legal consequences of the Satanic Panic were severe and enduring. What began as cultural fear morphed into institutional crisis, in which thousands of lives were upended by false beliefs, flawed psychology, and a justice system too eager to respond without evidence. Although eventually discredited, the panic remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, unchecked moral crusading, and the vulnerability of democratic institutions when driven by fear rather than facts.
The Pennsylvania Dutch are one of the many cultures that still hold with the superstitions of hexery and home remedies.
My ancestors and a lot of the people in this area, they were very religious, but they were also very superstitious. They believed that certain symbols prevented bad luck or brought them good luck.
In Lancaster County, hex signs, geometric designs, are painted on barns. These symbols are supposed to ward off evil and bring good luck. Most folk traditions brought to Pennsylvania by Swiss Germans were harmless superstitions. But in one fascinating case, the murder of a witch doctor was the only way out to break a deadly curse. This hex murder led to one of the most unusual homicide trials in Pennsylvania history. A story of witches and spells that took place less than 70 years ago. In the 1920s, John Blymeyer was a resident of York, Pennsylvania.
He was a wanderer. And throughout the years before 1928, he had had a great deal of difficulty. He had been sort of drifting around, looking for work. His wife had left him. Two of his three children had died. And he was more and more convinced that he was having these difficulties because someone had put a spell on him.
John Blymeyer was descended from a long line of powwow doctors who had earned their livelihoods through supposed powers to hex or heal. With this unusual family history, it was not surprising when Blymeyer became a victim of his own superstitions.
He went from one powwow doctor to another. Some reports have it that he talked to some 15 or 16 around York in an effort to find a way to resolve his problems.
In a state of deep depression, Blymeyer roamed the streets of York, where in the winter of 1928, he met John Curry, a runaway who greatly sympathized with Blymeyer.
Curry was a kind of waif of the street. So Blymeyer and Curry had common cause in the sense that they were both unfortunate individuals and wanderers, sort of what we would call today, I suppose, street people.
In a final desperate attempt to discover the source of his curse, Blymeyer traveled across the county to consult with yet another powwow doctor, a woman renowned for her skills at hexery.
Finally, he went to Mrs. Knoll, who lived in Marietta on the western edge of Lancaster County, just across the Susquehanna River. He consulted with Mrs. Knoll on several occasions. Mrs. Knoll told him that he was under a spell and that the person responsible for the spell, or the curse, was Nelson Raymeyer from Raymeyer's Hollow.
Raymeyer was a farmer and also a powwow doctor, and he had once been John Blymeyer's employer.
Blymeyer knew Raymeyer. Raymeyer had a little farm down in Raymeyer's Hollow, some 12 or 13 miles south of York. And Blymeyer had picked potatoes for Raymeyer on his farm several summers. The thing that confirmed in his mind that he was under a curse put on him by Nelson Raymeyer was the fact that Mrs. Knoll took a dollar bill and put it in the palm of his left hand. And as he looked at the picture of Washington on the dollar bill, it changed into the picture of Nelson Raymeyer.
John Blymeyer not only believed that Nelson Raymeyer was responsible for his curse, but also for the misfortunes of his friend, John Curry, and Wilbert Hess, a boy whose entire family felt bewitched.
So the whole Hess family believed that they were suffering under some kind of a curse.
Eager to break this hex, Blymeyer continued to consult with Mrs. Knoll.
Now, in the course of Blymeyer's conversations with Mrs. Knoll, she finally told him how he could break the curse. And what she told him he had to do was to go down to Raymeyer's house, Raymeyer's Hollow, which incidentally was a very isolated and lonely place. Go down to Raymeyer's house and get a lock of Raymeyer's hair and bury it 6 feet in the ground. This would break the curse.
Now, Blymeyer had to act. To help break the spell, he enlisted the aid of his friend John Curry. But they were unsuccessful in getting a lock of hair.
Because Raymeyer was a big man, and they were reluctant to tackle him until they had more help.
On the night of November 27th, 1928, Blymeyer and Curry returned to Raymeyer's house, this time with more muscle, Wilbert Hess.
Raymeyer turned to put wood in the stove in his kitchen. Curry and Blymeyer attacked him and started to wrestle him to the floor in an effort to get a lock of his hair. The struggle escalated. It went from the use of bare fists to the use of chair rungs to the use of blocks of wood. And it became a vicious, bloody encounter. Finally, after they literally beat the life out of this man, they put a rope around his neck and had him on the floor. And of course discovered that he was dead. They then doused the body with kerosene. They lit a match to it. And off they went.
But even Rehmeyer's death could not dispel Bleimeyer's fear.
Bleimeyer, at the trial, testified that when he looked back, he thought he saw the form of Nelson Rehmeyer, the spectral form of Nelson Rehmeyer, moving about in the fire.
3 days later, a neighbor summoned the coroner after discovering the partially burned and decomposed body of Nelson Rehmeyer. Within 2 days, Bleimeyer, Curry, and Hess were all arrested.
They, of course, had been apprehended quickly and put in jail. They all made confessions.
On trial, both Bleimeyer and Curry faced a cold and unyielding jury.
So the Curry jury came back with the same result as the Bleimeyer jury. They came back with murder 1, first degree, and a recommendation of life imprisonment. And it was a very, very tragic situation, particularly for the young boy Curry.
When Wilbert Hess came to trial, his defense attorney, Harvey Gross, portrayed Hess as a victim of witchcraft delusion. With this unusual argument, Gross won the sympathy of the jury.
He says that it was in the grip of this awful power that Wilbert went down to the hollow that night, believing that his parents and his family were living in mortal peril. And under the spell, Wilbert had no choice. The road to the hollow was his road to Gethsemane. His presence at Rehmeyer's house was his dark night at Golgotha.
The verdict shocked York County Court. Although Hess was a member of this murderous trio, he received a considerably lighter sentence than his counterparts, murder in the 2nd degree. The trial became headline news across the United States.
And then, of course, the papers, day after day, ran stories about this brutal, vicious murder that had been, the product had been stimulated, had been brought about as a result of a belief in witchcraft. And suddenly, York County became the cockpit of witchcraft. And people all over the country, all over the nation, began pointing to York County as the place where people were so committed to a belief in witches and witchcraft that they were prepared to murder as a result of this belief.
That was almost 70 years ago. This is today.
Guardians of the South, we invoke you. May the fires of renewal burn brightly in our lives. Hail and welcome.
Hail and welcome.
People are still fascinated with witches and witchcraft.
Called Satanism, and in some cases, to be driven into committing terrible deeds.
Whether myth or reality.
You get a lot of press on these half-hour early evening shows that are out to scandalize and shock us. And so they talk about blood-sucking cults and baby-eating cults and garbage-eating cults and so forth and so on.
The Satanic Panic was, in many respects, a uniquely American phenomenon. Its intensity, legal fallout, and fusion of evangelical Christianity with mass media sensationalism reflected specific US cultural dynamics. However, its reverberations did not stop at American borders. Through international media, imported evangelical literature, and shared cultural fears, echoes of the panic found their way to other English-speaking countries, including Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and to a more limited extent here in Ireland. Yet Ireland's religious, political and social landscape gave rise to a different kind of moral panic, one grounded more in reality than in conspiracy. To understand the extent of the panic's influence in Ireland, we must first examine the state of Irish society during the period in question. The 1980s and 1990s were decades of profound transformation. The power of the Catholic Church was beginning to erode, though it still led significant sway. Controversial issues like contraception, divorce and abortion were being publicly debated and legislated upon. Economic hardship, immigration and the ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland dominated public life. Irish society, long defined by a culture of deference to religious and state authority, began to reckon with the shadows of its own institutions. This would become particularly relevant in the 1990s and 2000s as the truth about institutional child abuse in Catholic-run schools, industrial schools and mother and baby homes came to light. Yet despite this period of upheaval, Ireland did not experience a satanic panic in the same form of intensity as the US. The reasons for this are both structural and cultural. One of the key reasons the Satanic Panic found fertile ground in the US was the rise of evangelical Protestantism, which tends to emphasize a literal belief in Satan, spiritual warfare and apocalyptic thinking. Ireland, by contrast, remained overwhelmingly Catholic throughout the 20th century. A tradition, while certainly concerned with sin and the devil, did not emphasize satanic conspiracies in the same way. Catholic theology often places more focus on institutional sin, personal confession and clerical authority, other than charismatic claims of spiritual warfare or demonic possession in daily life. As such, Catholic clergy in Ireland were generally less inclined to endorse or spread wild claims about satanic cults infiltrating communities. That said, charismatic Catholic movements such as the Medjugorje devotees and certain Marian cults did occasionally promote fear of diabolical forces, but these fears rarely spilled into criminal accusations or national policy the way they did in the United States. While Ireland did not generate its own satanic panic on a national scale, it was not entirely untouched by transatlantic influence. American television shows, films, books and evangelical tracts circulated widely in Ireland, particularly by the 1980s and 1990s, as global media expanded. Programs like Geraldo and sensationalist satanic expose documentaries were broadcast or written about in Irish newspapers. Tabloid papers such as the Sunday World or the Irish Daily Star occasionally printed lurid headlines linking horrific crimes to occult or satanic activity. In some cases, isolated murders, especially those with ritualistic or sexually deviant elements, were attributed to supposed devil worship, though no conclusive links to actual satanic cults were ever found. For example, in 1977, the brutal murder of a woman named Bridie Carrigan in Phoenix Park by Malcolm MacArthur caused public outrage, though it was not satanic in nature. However, the case fueled speculation and fear around evil lurking in plain sight. In the 1990s, a handful of murders in both Ireland and Britain involving teenagers with interest in black clothing, heavy metal or the occult were framed as satanic by the tabloids, despite lack of evidence. Ireland's exposure to the UK media landscape is also significant. British moral panics such as the 1990 Orkney satanic abuse case and the Cleveland child abuse scandal of 1987 were covered in Irish media and occasionally stirred debate. The Orkney case, where children were taken from their homes in dawn raids after allegations of satanic abuse, later collapsed due to lack of evidence and improper interviewing practices. These incidents, though not Irish, shared public imagination and added a layer of caution to Irish child protection services. Unlike in the US, Ireland did not experience mass allegations of satanic ritual abuse in daycare or schools, widespread use of recovered memory therapy in courts, or any national scandals involving underground satanic cults. Irish child protection cases focused on more real documented abuse, especially the abuse carried out by clergy and religious institutions. From the Ryan Report of 2009 to the Murphy Report 2009 and the revelations about the Bon Secours mother and baby home in Tuam, the focus in Ireland was not on imagined cults but on confronting systematic institutional horrors that had been covered up for decades. The irony is that while Americans were chasing phantoms in preschools, Irish authorities and survivors were gradually uncovering actual abuse perpetrated by respected religious and state institutions. The abuse was not hidden by satanic conspiracies but by clerical power, silence and state complicity. Although Ireland avoided a mainstream satanic panic, fringe religious groups and conspiracy theories did exist. By the early 2000s, small evangelical or Pentecostal groups in rural areas occasionally warned against Harry Potter, yoga, or Halloween as satanic, echoing American rhetoric. However, these groups remained on the periphery of Irish society and rarely influenced state policy or court cases. In more recent years, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, conspiracy theories with panic-era DNA, fears of elite cabals, child trafficking rings and satanic symbolism have begun to emerge in Irish social media spaces. Many of these are imported from American QAnon narratives and still echo the themes of the 1980s in panic, although in a digitized, globalized form. The Satanic Panic as it unfolded in the United States did not replicate itself in Ireland in the same form or intensity. Ireland's religious makeup, cultural conservation, and very real institutional abuse crisis created a different kind of moral reckoning, one rooted in fact rather than fantasy. While Ireland was not immune to imported fears, sensational headlines or fringe panic, its public discourse ultimately centred on real perpetrators within trusted institutions rather than imagined cults lurking in preschools. In many ways, the moral panic that gripped Ireland in the 2000s and beyond centred on clerical child abuse, which was more justified and more devastating than the fantasies conjured in the American imagination. If anything, the Irish experience offers a sobering counterpoint to the Satanic Panic, a society coming to terms not with fictitious evil, but with evil hidden in plain sight behind cassocks and communion rails.
As you receive the fire, think of the gifts of fire, of the warmth of our campfire, for which we surround monthly, of the summer that is to come, the warmth of the sun, and all the other courageous and powerful things that come from the fire.
This is a circle of witches from South Street in Philadelphia. They call themselves Wiccans and celebrate the pagan rituals that were practiced over 1,000 years ago in Europe.
There are different kinds of witches, just like there are different kinds of Christians and different kinds of Hindus and so on. I am a witch because I worship the old gods, I practice magic, I teach a craft which is passed from witch to witch.
From the goddess, and to her we shall return.
They're nature worshippers, they're goddess worshippers. They believe in the natural healing powers of magical practice.
O Lady of the White Moon, we seek you this night. Bless us and protect us. Keep us always in your light.
While some witch groups or covens use black magic to harm others, many witches forbid such practices.
I would not use magic to harm anyone. I would not allow anyone in my group to use magic like that.
Magic is a collection of rule-of-thumb techniques. It's an art form, it's a philosophy, it's a scientific approach, it's all these different things. And what it is designed to do is to enable you to generate psychic energy, shape it, and use it to make changes in the external or internal environment.
Wiccans have not only been accused of black magic, they are often confused with Satanists.
We have no link with the pagans also because pagans, like Judeo-Christians and other religions, believe in gods and goddesses. We don't care whether one believes in one god or a bunch of gods. That's completely antithetical to Satanism. We believe in no gods save ourselves.
When you're talking about Satanists, you're talking about fascists, jerks, and psychopaths. You're not talking about people who are involved in anything even vaguely resembling a legitimate religion.
You don't actively work to harm anyone unless they have moved to harm you specifically. We advocate revenge where someone has attacked you. Now, you should do this within the legal parameters of the society you're involved in, And if you feel strongly enough that justice has not been satisfied by that, you may choose to go beyond the legal parameters, but you have to be willing to accept the consequences of your actions. We're not devil worshippers. We do not believe that there is a God and a devil, and we have opted to follow the devil and thus be Christian heretics in a sense. We throw all of that out and say there is no God, there is no devil, there is no Christ. Satan for us originally in ancient Hebrew meant the adversary or opposer or accuser, and we believe that we are the adversaries.
They don't believe that Satan is a real deity. For them, Satan is a symbol for everything that is greatest about human beings, and for them, that is what is most bestial about people. The fact that they have carnal cravings, lust, greedy desires, and ambition.
Basically, in a satanic ritual, one starts in complete darkness. You light the candles, and then ring the bell 9 times. That purifies the chamber from all outside influences. Then one picks up the sword and points it at the symbol of Baphomet, which is the focal point of the ritual. Then the ritual goes very specifically as notated in the Satanic Bible. After the invocation to Satan, there's drinking from the chalice and reading of various invocations. And then we basically move into the centralized section of the ritual, which is directed toward whatever specific end one wants to achieve. And finally, we salute Satan by giving the sign of the horns, and end the ritual by ringing the bell 9 times again.
In American folklore, Satanists and witches are the same, but in reality, they are quite different.
The witch is only a benevolent figure, and usually a woman can be a man who is in tune with nature and the spiritual forces that surround us. In Satanism, you have a totally different use of the term witch, someone who knows how to turn Christian concepts and traditions upside down and inside out, who can officiate at a black mass, who can teach invocations of, who can say invocations of lust and destruction, vengeance of one kind or another.
What Americans term witches and witchcraft are really 4 distinct groups: Satanism, Voodoo, Wicca, and Neo-Paganism.
We are part of the overall neo-pagan community, which consists of a number of different religious movements that have all been founded around the ideas of nature worship, multiplicity of deities, adaptation to Aquarian Age ideals, if you will.
It is natural for Christians to lump together neo-paganism and Satanism as equally demonic activities. From a historical perspective, however, they're utterly different.
Witchcraft became, anybody was doing anything bad. Any kind of spells, healing, midwifery, being ugly, being frightening, and pretty soon the persecutions were way out of control.
From Salem in the 1690s to South Street, Philadelphia in the 1990s, Americans have attempted to dispel witches, sometimes through persecution, other times through prosecution, and today, sometimes through prejudice.
You would think that 301 years after Salem, people would be a little bit more cautious about pointing fingers at neighbors or friends or family, but people are not cautious in this regard.
I am not a witch! I'm not a witch!
According to a recent report in Ms. magazine, witchcraft, along with paganism, is one of the fastest growing religions in the country. An estimated 200,000 men and women are currently practicing Wiccan. But somehow, after centuries of myths and misconceptions, there seems a long way to go before most people can think of witchcraft as spiritual rather than supernatural.
As long as they keep making history, we'll keep writing their biographies. Peter Graves hosts the landmark television series Biography, the stories of extraordinary lives on the Arts and Entertainment Network.
The Satanic Panic remains one of the most revealing and disturbing moral panics in recent Western history. It was a time when fear overwhelmed fact, and when institutions, legal, psychological, media and even spiritual, converged in ways that caused real harm to real people. Although rooted uniquely American cultural dynamics, the panic had a ripple effect beyond US borders. Ireland, though largely untouched by the full-scale hysteria, offers an instructive counter-narrative, a society that uncovered institution abuse grounded in truth rather than fantasy. At the heart of the Satanic Panic was the power of narrative. In the United States, stories of hidden cults, abused children and demonic conspiracies captivated a public already anxious about social change. These narratives provided a simple explanation for complex problems: urban crime, youth rebellion, and the erosion of traditional family structures. But such stories were not just myths or folklore. They were deployed in courtrooms, childcare centres, and therapy sessions, often with devastating consequences. When society becomes gripped by fear, the line between imagination and reality becomes dangerously blurred. Accusations become proof, and doubt becomes complicity. Ireland's example reminds us that narratives have power in the opposite direction as well. For decades, the dominant cultural narrative denied or downplayed abuse by the church, the state, and other authorities. Survivors who spoke out were often disbelieved or silenced. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did the silence begin to break, led not by moral hysteria but by careful investigation, survivor testimony, and public reckoning. Both the US Satanic Panic and Ireland's abuse scandals revealed the dangers of institutions failing to regulate themselves. In the US, psychological and legal systems adopted unproven and dangerous methods, from recovered memory therapy to coercive child interviewing techniques, leading to wrongful accusations and imprisonments. Professionals who should have exercised skepticism instead became evangelicals for a cause that, in hindsight, was without merit. In Ireland, it was religious and state institutions that failed, suppressing or ignoring evidence of real abuse, in industrial schools, orphanages, and religious-run institutions. The failure was not one of overreaction, but of a systematic cover-up and denial. In both countries, trust in key institutions was shaken, and rightfully so. The cases highlight the need for rigorous ethical standards, proper oversight, and above all, the courage to balance empathy with evidence. Through the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s has receded, its legacy lingers in disturbing ways. Conspiracy theories like QAnon, which gained global traction in the late 2010s and 2020s, recycle many of the same themes. Hidden satanic elites, child exploitation rings, and global cabals operating behind the scenes. The same moral panic reflex, fear of evil infecting society, remains deeply embedded in public consciousness. These narratives now spread through digital channels, YouTube, Telegram, TikTok, rather than daytime talk shows, but the psychological mechanism is the same. In Ireland, such conspiracies have found small but growing audiences, especially amid the societal uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and economic instability. Some anti-lockdown and some anti-vaccine movements have incorporated satanic tropes into their rhetoric, drawing a direct line from the old panic to new fears. This underscores the importance of media literacy, critical thinking, and historical awareness. Without understanding the mistakes of the past, societies are doomed to repeat them, albeit in updated formats. Finally, both the American and Irish experiences serve as reminders of the need for compassion and clarity in the face of moral outrage. In the United States, the desire to protect children, a noble and necessary instinct, was manipulated into a frenzy that harmed the very people intended to help. In Ireland, the same instinct was often stifled by loyalty to church or state, leaving children in the hands of abusers. In both cases, real victims, whether falsely accused or genuinely abused, were failed by systems that prioritised image, ideology, or fear over truth and justice. The path forward requires a balanced approach, one that listens to survivors, demands evidence, scrutinises sources, and resists the easy seduction of scapegoating. Only then can society prevent future panics and properly address the real evils that do exist. The Satanic Panic was never really about Satan. It was about fear, power, trauma, and fragility of social trust. In the United States, that fear led to false memories, wrongful convictions, and decades of damage. In Ireland, the absence of that specific panic was not a sign of societal health, but rather a different kind of dysfunction, the silence around real abuse. What both societies teach us is that truth matters, and it is often more painful, more complex, and more necessary than any fiction. As we face new moral panic in the digital age, from child trafficking conspiracies to vaccine paranoia, we could do well to remember the lessons of the past, that justice without evidence is not justice, and that fear is a poor guide for public policy. Sinead Scale is Misha de Lero Shonatuma. Wheeler Buekas as for Quithoma, August Arish, August Igoni, Sloan, Gafol.